King Charles sat alone at Windsor, drowning in the weight of a crown he'd waited 76 years to wear. His health failing, his son William burdened beyond measure, his grandchildren George, Charlotte, and Louis facing futures he couldn't protect them from. Then he opened an envelope that shouldn't exist. A letter dated the 3rd of December 2075, written in his own handwriting, from 50 years in the future. The message was devastating. Don't make my mistake. Trust William with everything. The crown passes not when we choose, but when we're ready to let go. I wasn't ready. But Charles did something his future self never could. He chose to act. He told William, he told Kate. Together, they began rewriting their fate. Until Storm Helena proved the letter was real. Until the warning came true. Until a second envelope arrived at Kensington Palace, addressed to 11-year-old Prince George, with a date none of them were prepared to see. The rain came in sheets against the mullioned windows of Windsor Castle, each drop catching the amber glow of the desk lamp like a small, stuttering star. Charles sat alone in his private study, the kind of alone that settles into your bones after a long day of being watched, documented, discussed. The red dispatch boxes stood in their usual towers on the side table, government papers, correspondence, briefings that never seemed to end. Even at 76, even after waiting longer than any heir in British history, the work never stopped. Perhaps especially now. He reached for the next envelope in the stack, his reading glasses slipping slightly down his nose. Most of the correspondence blurred together after decades of this routine. Requests, condolences, invitations, the occasional crank letter that somehow made it past security. But this one stopped his hand mid-reach. Cream-colored paper, good quality, the kind that spoke of expense and care. But no royal seal embossed in the corner, no postmark at all, actually. No return, address, just his name, written in elegant script across the front. His Majesty, King Charles III. Strange, but not alarming. Not yet. He opened it with the silver letter opener that had been his father's, the blade sliding through the fold with a whisper. The letter inside was brief, barely a page, but the date at the top made his breath catch in his throat. The 3rd of December 2075, 50 years in the future. Charles set down the letter opener with a hand that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shake. This had to be someone's idea of a joke, a tasteless prank. Except the handwriting, when he looked closer, made his chest tighten with something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. The slant was his. The pressure on certain letters, the way the C in Charles looped with that particular flourish he'd developed over decades of signing documents. Even the ink looked like the deep blue-black of the Mont Blanc fountain pen currently resting beside his blotter. Every stroke, every curve, every microscopic detail screamed one impossible truth. He had written this letter, or he would write it, 50 years from now. His eyes moved down the page, and the words hit him like physical blows. My dear younger self, if you're reading this, then the impossible has found a way to reach backward through time. And you're sitting in that study at Windsor wondering if you've finally lost your mind. You haven't, though I wonder sometimes if I have, here at the end. There isn't much time to explain, and I'm not certain you'd believe me if I tried. But know this, something is coming. Soon, from your perspective. A choice that will define everything that follows. You'll want to hold on, God knows I did, but you must trust William with everything. Everything. The crown, the decisions, the burden you've carried so carefully for so long. The crown passes not when we choose, but when we're ready to let go. I wasn't ready. Don't make my mistake. Trust your son. Trust the timing, even when it feels too soon. With deepest regret, Charles R. The signature sat at the bottom like an accusation. Perfect. Too perfect. He pulled open his desk drawer, withdrew a stack of official correspondence he'd signed just that morning, and laid them side by side with the letter, identical. Charles set the paper down and pressed his palm against his chest, where his heart had been acting up lately. Nothing serious, the doctors assured him. Just the normal wear of age, of stress, of a life lived under constant scrutiny. But he felt it now. The irregular flutter, the sense of something winding down. The desk lamp cast his shadow long against the wall, and for a moment, looking at it, he could see himself as he might become older, frailer. A man at the end of his reign, riding backward through impossible years to warn himself about a mistake he couldn't quite name. Was this real? Could it be real? Or was he simply exhausted, ill, his mind playing tricks after too many long nights and too many questions about succession that he wasn't ready to answer? The rain kept falling. The castle kept standing. And Charles sat frozen between belief and terror, holding a letter that should not exist. He didn't move for hours. The study grew colder as the night deepened, but Charles remained in his chair, the letter held between trembling fingers, reading it again, and again, and again. Each time, he searched for some sign of forgery, some microscopic flaw that would let him dismiss this as an elaborate hoax. Each time, he found nothing but his own handwriting staring back at him with terrible authenticity. Trust William with everything. The words lodged themselves in his chest like a splinter. He'd been preparing William since birth, hadn't he? Every conversation, every walkthrough of constitutional duty, every gradual increase in responsibility, he trusted his son completely. Didn't he? But the letter suggested something else. It suggested he'd held back, that there was a difference between preparing someone and actually letting go, and he'd failed to understand that distinction until it was too late, until he wasn't ready, and the choice had been made for him anyway. His mother's voice echoed from decades ago, from a conversation in this very room, when he was young and she was newly crowned. He'd been complaining about something, the weight of expectations, probably the sense of being trapped in a life he hadn't chosen. She'd looked at him with those steady, unreadable eyes and said, "We carry the future on our shoulders, Charles. Every decision echoes. Every moment of weakness, every instant of strength. It all matters more than we can possibly understand while we're living it." At the time, he'd thought she was talking about legacy. Now, reading a letter from himself 5 decades hence, he wondered if she'd meant something else entirely. Something about the actual weight of time, the way it pressed down on you until you couldn't tell the difference between duty and imprisonment. Charles stood abruptly, the chair scraping against ancient floorboards, and walked to the window. Rain still streaked the glass in endless rivulets, distorting the grounds beyond into an impressionist blur of darkness and distant lights. But in the window's reflection, he could see himself, or a version of himself. The desk lamp behind him created a ghost image, translucent and hollow, superimposed over the real man standing before the glass. For a strange, vertiginous moment, he couldn't tell which version was which. The solid Charles staring out, or the phantom Charles staring back, caught between the lamp and the night like something suspended in amber. An old man, a future man. A man who'd written a warning and somehow sent it backward through impossible years. Don't make my mistake. The decision crystallized with the clarity that sometimes comes at 3 in the morning when you're too tired to lie to yourself anymore. He had to tell William. Not tomorrow. Not after he'd had time to think it through, analyze it, determine whether it was real. Tonight. Because if the letter was genuine, if he truly had 50 years of hindsight contained in those few devastating sentences, then waiting would be its own kind of mistake, the kind his future self was desperately trying to prevent. Charles turned from the window, picked up his mobile phone from the desk, and pulled up William's number before he could change his mind. His thumb hovered over the call button, then pressed down. The phone rang 3 times before William answered, his voice thick with sleep and instant worry. "Dad? What's wrong?" "No, hello." No confusion about why his father might be calling at 11 at night. Just the immediate assumption of crisis, because that's what late-night calls had meant lately. Hospital visits, test results, careful conversations about medication adjustments, and reducing stress that always circled around the thing none of them would say aloud: mortality. Charles heard the rustle of bedsheets, could picture William sitting up in the darkness, Kate stirring beside him with that expression of concern that never quite left her face anymore when the phone rang after hours. "I need you to come to Windsor," Charles said, keeping his voice carefully measured, level, professional, even as though this were a normal request. "First thing tomorrow morning. Just you." Silence on the other end. Then, "Is it your health?" The question they were all dancing around constantly now, wrapped in politeness and medical euphemisms, but always there, lurking beneath every conversation. "Is this it? Is this the call?" "No," Charles said, and felt the inadequacy of the word. I can't explain over the phone. Please, William, I need to see you." Another pause. Charles could hear Kate's voice in the background, muffled but urgent. "What's happened? Is he all right?" "I'll be there at 8, William said finally. "Should I bring—" "Just you," Charles repeated. It's something I need to show you first. Before anyone else." "All right." William's voice had shifted into that mode Charles recognized from decades of watching his son grow into his role. Steady, reliable, ready to handle whatever crisis was unfolding. It was simultaneously reassuring and heartbreaking. "Dad, you're sure you're okay?" "I don't know," Charles admitted, and the honesty of it surprised them both. "I'll see you in the morning." He ended the call before William could ask anything else, before he had to explain the unexplainable. At Kensington Palace, William lay back against the pillows, but sleep had fled entirely now. Kate's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers lacing through his with the easy intimacy of 20 years together. "What do you think it is?" she whispered. "I don't know." William stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from the streetlights outside play across the plaster. But he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to say the word that had lodged itself in his throat like a stone. Scared. His father had sounded scared. And if Charles was scared Charles, who'd faced down media firestorms and constitutional crises, and the weight of waiting 7 decades for a crown, then something was very, very wrong. Kate moved closer, resting her head against his shoulder. Neither of them spoke again, but neither of them slept. They lay together in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of London beyond the palace walls, waiting for morning and whatever impossible thing was coming with it. Back at Windsor, Charles sat at his desk as the night crawled toward dawn. The letter remained in front of him, the date clearly visible in the lamplight. 2075. 50 years away. A lifetime. Or no time at all. Dawn broke over Kensington Palace in shades of pearl and rose, the kind of gentle morning that felt like a lie against the tension coiled in William's chest. He'd been awake for hours, showered and dressed by 6:30, his tie knotted too tight around his throat. Now he sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee he couldn't quite bring himself to drink. Around him, the morning unfolded with the tender chaos of 3 children getting ready for their day. George moved through his routine with the methodical precision he'd inherited from William's school uniform laid out the night before, each button fastened in order, shoes buffed to a careful shine. At 11, he was already practicing the art of presentation, of being perpetually camera-ready, though they tried so hard to let him just be a child. From the bathroom, Charlotte's voice rang out in a pop song she'd learned from some YouTube video, the lyrics mangled but enthusiastic. 8 years old and still convinced the world existed primarily for her entertainment, William felt a fierce surge of protectiveness listening to her, wanted to freeze this moment before everything got complicated. Louis, at 5, had different priorities. He sat on the kitchen floor, wearing one blue sock and one red sock, absolutely refusing to match them, no matter what Kate said. "Darling, you can't go to school like that," Kate coaxed, crouching beside him with a matching pair. "Why not?" Louis challenged. "They're both socks. They're different colors." "So?" "I'm different than other people. My socks should be too." Despite everything, the sleepless night, The worry gnawing at his stomach, the drive to Windsor looming. William felt his mouth twitch into something almost like a smile. Kate glanced up, caught his eye, and returned the expression with a warmth that also carried the weight of shared fear. She knew him too well, knew the smile was armor. George appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack already on, and his gaze went immediately to William. "Are you going to see Grandpa?" William nodded, not trusting his voice. George's follow-up was immediate, perceptive in the way that sometimes stopped William's heart. "Is he sick again?" The question hung in the air. Charlotte emerged from the bathroom, suddenly quiet, and even Louis looked up from his sock rebellion. All three children watching their father with variations of the same expression: worry, trying to hide behind childhood. William stood, walked over, and crouched down to George's level, a gesture that had become ritual between them, this eye-to-eye honesty that he'd learned from his mother. Diana had always knelt when she talked to him about difficult things, made herself small so he wouldn't feel small. "I don't think so," William said carefully. "But I'm going to find out. Grandpa just needs to talk to me about something important." George searched his father's face with those solemn eyes. "You'll tell us if something's wrong? You won't just pretend?" The lump in William's throat grew larger. "I'll tell you what you need to know. I promise." Charlotte broke the tension by wrapping her arms around William's neck from behind, nearly toppling him. "Tell him we love him," she said fiercely into his ear. "Tell Grandpa we love him lots." "I will, sweetheart." William pulled her around to hug her properly, then opened his arm for Louis, who abandoned his sock protest to join the embrace. George remained standing, too old for group hugs, but his hand rested on William's shoulder. For a moment, they stayed like that, a father and his three children, frozen in the morning light of a kitchen that smelled like toast and coffee, holding on to each other before the day could fracture them apart. Kate walked William to the door, the children now distracted by breakfast. In the hallway, away from young ears, she reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his jaw. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "we'll handle it. Together. What if it's worse than we think?" The question escaped before he could stop it, voicing the fear that had kept him awake all night. Then, "We'll handle that too." But her eyes betrayed her, carrying the same terror that lived in his chest. They'd been through so much already: the media scrutiny, the loss of family members, the constant pressure of knowing their children's lives were mapped out before them. But something about this felt different, felt final, in a way neither of them wanted to name. William kissed her forehead, then her mouth, holding the moment for one extra breath before pulling away. He drove himself to Windsor, waving off the protection officers who moved to follow. This needed to be private. Whatever impossible thing his father had to show him, it required the kind of privacy that didn't exist anymore in their lives except in stolen moments like this. Just a son, driving through the winter morning to see his father, watching the landscape blur past and trying not to think about letters dated 50 years in the future, or warnings about mistakes not yet made, or the possibility that everything was about to change in ways he couldn't control. The road stretched ahead, and William followed it toward Windsor, toward answers, toward whatever waited in his father's study with the rain-streaked windows and the impossible envelope, toward the future that was already happening, every day, whether they were ready for it or not. William found his father in the study where he'd left him the night before, or perhaps Charles had never left at all. The king stood by the window, still wearing yesterday's clothes, the morning light cruel against the exhaustion carved into his face. In his hand, he held a single sheet of cream-colored paper that seemed to pulse with importance even from across the room. "Before I show you this," Charles began without preamble, without the usual pleasantries that structured their formal relationship, "I need you to promise you won't think I've lost my mind." William's concern, already running high from the sleepless night and anxious drive, deepened into something close to fear. "Dad, what's going on?" Charles didn't answer. He simply crossed the room and handed William the letter. The paper, trembling slightly in his grip before William took it. The date hit first, the 3rd of December 2075. William's eyes flicked to his father's face, searching for signs of a joke, a test, something that would make this make sense, but Charles only watched him with hollow eyes that held no humor at all. William Reed. His face went through a journey that Charles recognized because he'd traveled it himself just hours before. Confusion at the impossible date, disbelief at the content, then something that looked uncomfortably like fear as the implications began to unfold. William's hand came up unconsciously to touch his own chest, mirroring the gesture Charles had made the night before, as if checking that his heart still beat in the present tense. "This is a joke," William said flatly when he reached the signature. "Someone's idea of—" "Look at the signature," William did. Really looked, this time, not just glancing but studying the loops and slants, the pressure points, the microscopic details that made handwriting as unique as a fingerprint. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire, until it became its own kind of answer. "Where did you get this?" William's voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the tone he used when he was working hard not to panic. Charles walked him through everything. The red box, the envelope with no postmark or seal, the moment of opening it and feeling reality tilt sideways. How he'd compared it to his own signature on a dozen different documents and found nothing, not a single variation that would mark it as forgery. How he'd sat with it through the endless hours of night, reading and rereading until the words had burned themselves into his brain. William studied the paper itself now, holding it up to the light, feeling the texture between his fingers, looking for some rational explanation, some crack in the impossible that would let logic back in. "What does it mean?" he asked finally. "Don't make my mistake." Charles' voice cracked when he answered, "I think it means I hold on too long, that I don't prepare you properly because I'm too busy being king, too busy proving I can do this, that I waited all those years for a reason, that I'm not just a placeholder between my mother and you." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and undefended. This was the fear Charles had never spoken aloud to anyone, that his entire reign would be a footnote, a brief intermission before the main event of William's kingship, that everything he'd waited for, sacrificed for, would amount to nothing more than keeping the seat warm. "You've been preparing me my entire life," William said, and there was something fierce in his voice now, protective. "Every moment has been preparation. Every conversation, every responsibility you've given me, every—" "But have I prepared you?" Charles interrupted. "Or have I just showed you the weight, let you watch me carry it and called that training?" He sank into his desk chair, as though his legs could no longer hold him. "The letter says to trust you with everything. Not someday, not when I'm gone, everything. And I think it means I failed to do that. That I held on because I was too afraid of becoming irrelevant, of finishing my life's work before I'd barely started, and by holding on, He couldn't finish, didn't need to." The implications were clear enough. William crossed to his father, pulled up a chair so they sat knee to knee, the way they'd sat when William was small and needed reassurance about school or bullies, or the weight of being born to a life he hadn't chosen. "You've never made me feel unprepared," William said carefully. "Scared, yes, overwhelmed sometimes, but unprepared? No. You've given me everything you have. Have I?" Charles looked at him with such naked vulnerability that William had to fight the urge to look away. "Or have I given you the performance of kingship without the substance, the image without the real decisions, the authority without the actual power? What are you saying?" "I'm saying the letter might be right, that there's a difference between showing you how to be king and actually letting you be king, while I'm still here to guide you. And I'm terrified that my fear of irrelevance will make me hold on until it's too late, until the choice is taken from me instead of offered." His hand pressed against his chest again. That gesture William was coming to dread. Until my body makes the decision, my pride couldn't. They sat in shared silence then, the impossible letter resting on the desk between them. Outside the window, Windsor's grounds spread in winter starkness, bare trees, dormant gardens, everything waiting for a spring that would eventually come, whether anyone was ready or not. "We don't know if it's real," William said finally. "No," Charles agreed. "But does that matter?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, perhaps the point isn't whether I actually wrote this 50 years from now. Perhaps the point is what it's forcing me to confront today. The questions it's asking. The mistakes it's warning me against." Charles picked up the letter, read it again as though it might have changed. Time travel or hoax, it doesn't change the fact that these fears are real. That the warning might be necessary, regardless of its source. William had no answer for that. So he did what sons do when fathers break. He reached across the space between their chairs and gripped Charles's shoulder, solid and steady and present in a way that said more than words could manage. William called Kate from Charles's study, while his father stepped out to give him privacy, or perhaps to compose himself. The conversation was brief. "Can you come to Windsor? Now? Alone?" Kate heard something in his voice that made her drop everything without question, arranging for the nanny to watch the children and driving herself through London traffic with her heart in her throat. She found them both in the study an hour later, two men who looked like they'd weathered a storm. Charles had changed clothes but still carried exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. William paced near the window, unable to settle. "Show her," William said. Charles handed Kate the letter without preamble. She read standing up, her face going through the same progression William's had: confusion, disbelief, then a careful blankness that William recognized as her emotional armor clicking into place. When she finished, her first response was entirely practical. "Have you had it analyzed? Checked for fingerprints? Could someone have broken in to deliver this?" "I've told no one but you two," Charles said. "It appeared in my red box sometime yesterday evening. No one saw it delivered. Security has no record of any breach." Kate read the letter again, slower this time, her trained eye looking for the practical details that might explain the impossible. But when she reached the signature, she stopped, looked up at Charles with something like pity. "Do you believe it's real?" She asked the question they'd all been avoiding, dancing around. The pause stretched long enough that Kate lowered herself into a chair, still holding the letter like it might detonate. "I don't know what I believe anymore," Charles admitted. Kate's gaze moved back to the page, landing on the phrase that had clearly lodged itself in all their minds. "Trust William with everything." "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. "Everything." The implications unfurled in the silence between them. Succession planning beyond the usual gradual transitions, abdication discussions no one was ready to have, health decisions that currently remained Charles alone, the entire future of the monarchy called into question by a letter that shouldn't exist. "We need to keep this contained." Kate's instinct kicked in, the protective pragmatism that had helped her navigate 15 years of royal life. "If the press gets hold of..." "It's not about the press," William interrupted, and there was something sharp in his voice. "It's about us, our family, what this means for how we move forward." Whether the letter is genuine or someone's elaborate mind game, Kate looked between them, saw the way father and son had already moved past skepticism into something deeper, belief, or at least the willingness to act as though belief didn't matter because the questions raised were real regardless. "I need a moment," she said abruptly, standing. "I need to." Just a moment. She left before either of them could respond, walking quickly through Windsor's corridors until she found the palace chapel, small and mercifully empty at midday. She slid into a back pew and let herself fully feel what she'd been holding back in that study. Terror. Not the manageable kind that came with press intrusion or public criticism or even the health scares they'd weathered before. This was existential, the kind of fear that came from realizing the future you'd carefully prepared for might arrive decades early, that your children's childhoods might be cut even shorter than you'd planned, that the letters warning about mistakes suggested all of them were stumbling towards something they couldn't see clearly enough to avoid. Kate pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed through it, the way she'd learned to do when panic threatened. 1 breath, 2, 5, until her heart rate slowed and she could think again instead of just feel. When she returned to the study 20 minutes later, her armor was back in place, but her eyes carried a new weight that William recognized instantly. "We have decisions to make," she said, "starting with what we tell the children." Evening found William and Kate in their private sitting room at Kensington Palace, the children finally asleep after a bedtime routine that had felt both precious and fragile. The letter sat on the coffee table between them like an unexploded bomb, cream-colored and impossible and demanding responses they didn't know how to give. "We have to tell them something," Kate said, curled into the corner of the sofa with her feet tucked under her. "George already knows something's wrong. You saw his face at breakfast." "Tell them what?" William stood at the window, looking out at London's lights without really seeing them. "That Grandpa received a letter from himself in the future, warning about mistakes he hasn't made yet? They're children, Kate. George is 11. Charlotte's 8. Louis is 5. They're our children," Kate countered gently. "They've already lived through more than most kids ever will. Media scrutiny, public appearances, knowing every milestone of their lives is documented and discussed. We've been honest with them about the hard parts before." The debate unfolded in the careful way of partners who knew each other's pressure points, knew how far to push before backing off, what to share, how to frame it, whether to mention the succession implications or keep it vague, whether honesty meant telling everything or just enough truth to prepare them without terrifying them. William stopped pacing, his hand coming up to rub the back of his neck, a gesture Kate recognized as his tell when memory was surfacing, usually painful. "I keep thinking about something," he said quietly. "I was about George's age when Mum sat me down to explain why the photographers followed us everywhere, why we couldn't go to McDonald's like normal families, why she and Dad were always in the papers." He turned from the window to meet Kate's eyes. "She tried so hard to shield us, but she also knew we needed to understand that pretending everything was normal would hurt us more in the long run." "What did she say?" "That the truth, even when it's scary, is still better than lies wrapped up as protection." William sank onto the 5 sofa beside Kate, close enough that their knees touched. "I don't want to steal their childhood." "God, Kate, they're so young, and this is so much, and I just—" "You won't," Kate interrupted, taking his hand. "We're not stealing anything. We're giving them truth, which is different than stealing innocence. They'll lose innocence eventually anyway, just by being who they are. At least this way, they'll have honest parents guiding them through it." They decided then, in the quiet of their sitting room, with London humming beyond the windows, a modified truth. Grandpa had received a strange letter that worried him. It had made him think about the future, about changes that might come, about making sure everyone was prepared. Age appropriate for each child, George could handle more context. Charlotte needed emotional reassurance. Louis just needed to know everyone was okay. They would tell them at breakfast, together, as a family. "He asked me today if I was scared," William said after a long silence. "George asked me straight out if I was scared." "What did you say?" "That I'd find out what was wrong and let him know." William's laugh was hollow. "I should have just said yes. That would have been the truth." Kate leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that as the evening deepened into night, holding each other against the weight of impossible letters and futures rushing toward them faster than they were ready to meet. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp winter sunlight that made everything look sharper, more real. The Kensington Palace kitchen filled with the usual breakfast sounds, cereal being poured, juice splashing into cups, Louis humming tunelessly while Charlotte scrolled through something on her tablet that she probably wasn't supposed to have at the table. But the children sensed something immediately. Their parents were too careful, too gentle, moving around them with the kind of tender attention that meant serious conversations were coming. George's eyes tracked between William and Kate as he ate his toast, missing nothing. William cleared his throat. "Grandpa received something unusual yesterday," he began, keeping his voice even. "A letter that's confusing. And it's made us think about some important things we need to talk about as a family." The temperature in the room dropped. Charlotte's tablet went still. Louis stopped humming mid-note. "Is Grandpa dying?" George asked, voice flat and direct in that way he had of cutting through pretense, straight to the heart of what adults were trying not to say. The bluntness landed like a physical blow. Silence crashed down around them. Kate recovered first, her voice steady. "We don't think so, sweetheart." But the letter made him realize he wants to make sure everything is taken care of. That everyone is ready. Ready for what? Charlotte's voice had gone small. "Scared. For anything," William said carefully, watching his daughter's face. "For changes that might come. For the future that's always coming, whether we're prepared or not." Louis, pragmatic as always in the way only 5-year-olds can be offered. "Like, when I go to big school?" The innocence of it. The way he'd compared potential kingship and succession to starting primary school broke something in the tension. Kate smiled despite herself. Despite everything. "Yes, darling. Exactly like that." But George wasn't satisfied with gentle deflections. He pushed deeper. The letter was about Dad becoming king, wasn't it? William and Kate exchanged glances. The silent communication of parents who'd learned to read each other's micro-expressions across 13 years of partnership. Part of it was about that, William admitted. George's next question cut to the absolute heart. "Are you scared?" William could have deflected, could have offered reassurance wrapped in parental authority, could have lied, basically, the way adults do when they think children need protection from hard truths. Instead, after a long pause, he said, "Yes, sometimes I am." The honesty transformed the room. Charlotte slid off her chair and climbed into William's lap without a word, wrapping her arms around his neck. Louis, not fully understanding but recognizing the gravity, mimicked his sister with Kate. George stayed at the table, processing with that solemn intensity that sometimes made him look decades older than 11. "But you'll do it anyway?" he asked. "Yes. Because it's your duty? Because it's our family," William corrected gently, one arm around Charlotte while his other hand reached across to cover George's, where it rested on the table. "And we face things together, all of us. No matter what comes." Charlotte's voice was muffled against William's shoulder. "I don't want Grandpa to go away." Kate pulled her over, settling Charlotte between them. "None of us do, sweetheart. But the letter isn't about Grandpa going away. It's about making sure we're all ready for whatever happens. Together. That's what families do. They prepare each other." The conversation wound down from there into practical reassurances. No immediate changes. Grandpa was okay. They would keep talking as things developed. Nothing was certain or decided. The children absorbed it with varying degrees of understanding. George filing it away to worry about later, Charlotte needing extra hugs, Louis mostly concerned about whether they'd still go to the park that afternoon. But as they cleared breakfast dishes and the morning shifted into its normal weekend rhythm, George paused at the kitchen doorway and said, so quietly they almost missed it, "The future is already happening, isn't it? Every day, we're moving toward it." William and Kate froze, looked at their son standing there 11 years old and already carrying wisdom that shouldn't fit in such a young soul. "Yes," William said simply. "It is." George nodded once, accepting this the way he'd learned to, accept so many impossible things about his impossible life, and went to join his siblings. Later that afternoon, Kate retreated to the palace gardens, needing distance from the careful cheerfulness of the house. The winter bare trees stood like sentinels along the paths, branches stripped to their essential architecture. She walked with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, not really seeing where her feet took her. She found a bench, eventually, tucked away between dormant rose bushes, and sat. And finally allowed herself to cry. Not the stoic, cameras might be watching tears. Not the careful grief of public mourning. Deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere primal and terrified. The kind of crying you only do when you're absolutely certain no one can see. The weight of what was coming pressed down on her chest like a physical thing. 3 children who already lived under microscopes, who already had their futures mapped and discussed and dissected, now facing the possibility of even less childhood than she'd hoped to give them, and herself she'd married into this knowing what it meant. But there was knowing, and then there was knowing, wasn't there? The difference between understanding intellectually that William would be king someday and watching that someday rush toward them 50 years too early. A flashback surfaced. Kate at 7 in her childhood home in Berkshire, playing in a garden that was hers alone. No photographers lurking, no protocol, no weight of history pressing down on every choice. Ordinary and safe, and so impossibly distant now. Don't make my mistake, the letter had warned. But what if their mistake was different? What if they prepared the children too much and stole the innocence they were trying to protect? Or too little and left them vulnerable to a role that would devour them? Kate. She looked up to find William standing a few feet away, not intruding but present. He didn't say anything else, just sat beside her on the bench and took her hand. I'm terrified, she admitted, her voice raw from crying. So am I. What if we can't protect them from this? William was quiet for a long moment, watching winter sun filter through bare branches above them. We can't, he said finally, and the honesty of it was somehow both devastating and freeing. But we can face it with them. We can be honest and present, and refuse to let them face any of it alone. Kate leaned against him, and they breathed together in and out, finding steadiness in shared fear, the way they'd learned to do over 13 years of facing impossible things as a team. Do you believe the letter is real? She asked after a while. I think, William chose his words carefully, I think it doesn't matter if it's literally from the future. It's real in what it's making us confront. The inevitability we've been avoiding, the timing we can't control, the readiness that never feels sufficient no matter how much we prepare. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the garden. Eventually they would have to go back inside, back to their children and their responsibilities and the impossible letter waiting on Charles' desk. But for this moment, they sat together in the winter cold, 2 people finding courage in the warmth of each other's presence. Together, they would face it together. That would have to be enough. Sunday lunch at Windsor unfolded with the careful choreography of royal routine, silver on china, staff moving soundlessly through doorways, the children's laughter drifting in from the adjacent drawing room where they'd been released to play after eating. But in the dining room, over coffee that had gone lukewarm, the adults sat in a silence that felt less like peace and more like the stillness before a storm. Charles set down his cup with the kind of deliberate care that meant he'd made a decision. There's something else in the letter I didn't tell you. William and Kate went very still. The children's voices seemed suddenly distant, muffled, as though the world had contracted to just this table, these 3 people, and whatever truth was about to be spoken. The letter contained specific details, Charles continued, not meeting their eyes. Dates, events, small things that haven't happened yet, but are close enough to verify. To prove whether this is, he trailed off. The word real hanging unspoken but understood. Like what? William's voice was carefully neutral, but Kate saw the way his hand tightened around his coffee cup. Charles finally looked up, and there was something in his face that looked like relief. The relief of sharing a burden he'd been carrying alone for too long. It mentions a storm. A particular storm that will hit Scotland in 3 weeks. On January 7th. It gives the name Storm Helena. says it will damage Balmoral's north wing, specifically the turret facing the lock. The specificity of it landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. So, we wait 3 weeks, Kate said slowly, her practical mind already working through implications, and see if, yes, if Storm Helena happens exactly as described, with that name, on that date, hitting that precise location. Charles didn't need to finish. They all understood what it would mean. The implications settled over them like snowfall, silent, accumulating, impossible to brush away. If the letter was right about the storm, then it was right about everything else. The warning, the mistake, the future rushing toward them faster than they could prepare. William asked the question that had been building since he first read the letter. What else does it say? About me? Charles hesitated, and in that hesitation, Kate saw the full weight of fatherhood, the terrible burden of potentially hurting your child with truth, weighed against the greater harm of lies. It says, I ask too much of you, Charles said finally, his voice barely above a seeing whisper. That I lean on you when I should be letting you lead. That I confuse preparing you with, burdening you. That I hold on because I'm afraid of becoming irrelevant before I've had a chance to prove my worth, and in holding on, I steal your chance to prove yours. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and undefended. This was the fear at Charles' core, that his entire reign would be measured not by what he accomplished, but by how long he delayed the inevitable. William's response was gentle, instinctive. You've never been a burden, haven't I? Charles's voice cracked. Every time my health fails, every time I need you to step in for an engagement, a decision, a crisis, every time I ask you to carry the weight while I recover, while I catch my breath, while I pretend I have decades left, when we both know. He pressed his hand to his chest again, that unconscious gesture that had become ritual. I burden you and call it preparation. I lean on you and call it partnership. But the letter says that's not enough. That there's a choice coming, and if I wait for circumstances to make it for me, I'll have waited too long. The word neither of them had spoken aloud, crystallized in the silence. Abdication. Kate spoke carefully, her voice steady, despite the way her heart hammered. Is that what you're considering? I don't know, Charles admitted, and the honesty was almost worse than certainty. But the letter suggests I should be. That there's a moment, a window, when the choice can be made with dignity and planning rather than desperation and crisis. And I think I'm afraid I'll miss that moment because I've wanted this for so long. Outside the dining room windows, Windsor's gardens stretched in winter dormancy, everything stripped to essential bones, waiting for spring. Inside, 3 people sat with the future mapped in impossible handwriting, trying to decide whether foreknowledge was gift or curse. William reached across the table, covering his father's hand with his own. We have 3 weeks, he said, until Storm Helena, until we know. Maybe we shouldn't make any decisions until then. Charles nodded, gripping his son's hand like a lifeline. 3 weeks. But they all knew the waiting would be the hardest part, living in the space between certainty and hope, between the present and a future that might already be written. Later, when coffee had been cleared and the weight of confession had lifted enough to breathe again, they gathered the children for a walk through Windsor's gardens. It was the kind of winter afternoon that looked beautiful from inside crisp blue sky, frost glittering on bare branches but felt sharp against exposed skin. George walked beside Charles, his small hand tucked into his grandfather's larger one, while Charlotte and Louis raced ahead with William and Kate, their voices bright with the kind of joy that only children can access, even in the shadow of adult worry. Grandpa, George said after they'd walked in companionable silence for a while, are you going to stop being king? Charles stopped walking so abruptly that George stumbled slightly. Why do you ask that? I heard Daddy say something to Mummy about choosing, about you choosing something important. George looked up with those solemn eyes that saw far too much. And you've been different since the letter came, sadder. Like you're deciding something hard. Charles crouched down to George's level, mirroring the gesture William had made in their kitchen just days before. This ritual of meeting children eye to eye when truth needed to be spoken. His knees protested the position, reminding him of age, of time passing, whether he acknowledged it or not. "I don't know yet, George," he said honestly. "But if I did, if I chose to step aside and let your father become king, would that scare you?" George considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. "It would mean Daddy becomes king. Yes. And someday, I will. Yes." A long pause. George's gaze drifted across the gardens to Windsor Castle, rising behind them ancient stone, centuries of history, the weight of it all visible even in a child's understanding. When he looked back at Charles, there was something old in his young face. "Is it hard?" he asked quietly. "Being king?" Charles could have offered platitudes, could have softened the truth the way adults do when they think children need protection from reality. Instead, he chose honesty. "It's the greatest honor and the loneliest job in the world." George absorbed this, filing it away in whatever part of his mind stored the difficult truths about his future. "Does the letter tell you what to do?" "It tells me what not to do," Charles said. "That might be more important. Knowing what mistakes to avoid rather than what path to follow." Charlotte's shriek of laughter cut through the winter air as Louis tackled her in a pile of leaves that the gardeners had left gathered. They tumbled together, completely unaware of the gravity unfolding between grandfather and grandson, still young enough to live entirely in the present. George watched his siblings with an expression Charles couldn't quite read, longing, maybe, for that kind of uncomplicated joy. Or perhaps just love, fierce and protective, for the innocence he was already leaving behind. "I think you should do what makes them happiest," George said, turning back to Charles. "The letter can tell you what happens, but you have to choose what's right, for all of us." Charles felt something catch in his throat. "When did you get so wise?" George's smile was small, fleeting. "Daddy says I'm an old soul. I don't think that's always a good thing." Then he pulled his hand free and ran toward his siblings, joining their game with forced enthusiasm that fooled everyone except Charles. The king, or perhaps the man who wouldn't be king much longer, stood alone in the Risport winter garden, watching 3 generations at play. William caught his eye across the distance, a question in his gaze that Charles answered with a slight nod. They'd raised remarkable children. Children who saw clearly, who spoke truth, who would carry impossible burdens with grace because that's what they'd been born to do. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it broke his heart a little more. 3 weeks felt both endless and impossibly brief. January 7th arrived with the strange inevitability of prophecy, the date they'd all been watching, dreading, hoping might pass unremarkably and prove the letter wrong. Instead, the morning news opened with meteorological reports. A massive storm system bearing down on Scotland, the worst in decades, already named Storm Helena by forecasters who had no idea they were confirming the impossible. At Kensington Palace, William and Kate sat on their sofa while the children slept upstairs, watching news coverage with a phone on the coffee table between them like a ticking bomb. The meteorologist traced Helena's projected path with bright graphics, the trajectory matching exactly what Charles's letter had described. "It could still be coincidence," Kate said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Storm names are assigned in advance. Someone could have known, could have researched. The trajectory, though." William pointed at the screen, where the storm's path carved directly toward Balmoral. The timing, the specific prediction about the north wing. They watched in silence as Helena made landfall, watched the wind speeds climb, watched the footage of trees bending nearly horizontal and rain driving sideways across the highlands. Somewhere in that chaos, Balmoral stood in the path of forces that cared nothing for history or heritage or the impossible letter that had predicted this moment. The phone rang at 9:47 p.m. William grabbed it on the first ring. Yes? The estate manager's voice was tight with stress. Sir, I'm calling about the damage assessment. The north wing, the turret facing the lock. Just as His Majesty asked us to watch, it sustained significant structural damage. The stonework has partially collapsed. It's exactly where and how he said it would be. William closed his eyes. Beside him, Kate had gone very still, reading the truth in his face. Thank you, William managed. Please proceed with emergency repairs and send the full report. He ended the call and immediately dialed his father. Charles answered before it could ring twice. You saw? Yes. A long silence, filled with everything they couldn't say over the phone, with the weight of impossible things becoming undeniably real. So what now? William asked. Charles's voice, when he answered, carried a new quality, not quite resignation, but something like acceptance. Now we decide what to do with the future we've been given. All of us. Together. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. Bring the children. They deserve to be part of this. After William hung up, he and Kate sat in the blue glow of the television, which had moved on to other news, but still occasionally flashed back to Helena's destruction. The storm raged across Scotland, doing exactly what a letter from the future had said it would do, proving beyond doubt that they were living in a world where time could reach backward and futures could be known. It's real, Kate whispered, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. William pulled her close, and they held each other as the storm played out on screen, and somewhere in Windsor, Charles sat alone with a letter that had just proven itself true, waiting for the morning when decisions that had seemed theoretical would become terrifyingly concrete. Monday morning found them all gathered in Charles's private drawing room at Windsor. William, Kate, and all three children seated on sofas, while Charles stood by the window, the letter held in his hands like scripture. Winter light filtered through, ancient glass, casting patterns across carpet that had witnessed centuries of family councils, of decisions that shaped nations. But perhaps none quite like this: a king, his heir, and three children who would inherit the consequences of whatever was decided in this room. I've spent 3 weeks thinking about this, Charles began, his voice steady despite everything. This letter from myself or someone, something that warned me about holding on too long, about not trusting you, William, with what needs to be shared, about confusing preparation with control, and, William prompted gently when his father paused. And I think it's right. Charles turned from the window to face them all. Not about abdication, not yet, perhaps not ever, but about opening the door. Sharing more than I have, preparing you not just for the role, but for the moment when it comes. Treating succession as a partnership rather than an eventual transfer of power. The conversation that unfolded was part negotiation, part confession, part family therapy. Charles proposed a transition plan, more responsibility for William, involvement in decisions that had previously been solely the monarch's domain, regular councils where they would discuss not just policy but the philosophical weight of kingship itself. A gradual opening of doors that Charles had kept closed out of fear, out of pride, out of the desperate need to prove he could do this alone. Kate asked practical questions about logistics, about how such a transition would be communicated publicly, about protecting the children from media speculation. William asked emotional ones about his father's health, about whether this was really what Charles wanted or just what the letter had convinced him he should want. George, who had been silent through it all, suddenly spoke up. Does this mean you're choosing when to stop being king instead of waiting for the end? The bluntness of it, that directness that could still take them by surprise, stopped all adult conversation. Charles nodded slowly. I think it means I'm choosing to be honest about time, about what I can do and what I should pass on, about mortality and legacy and the difference between holding power and wielding it well. He looked at his grandson with something like wonder. The letter says, I made a mistake by waiting. I'm trying not to make it. Charlotte, who had been sitting very close to Kate, spoke quietly. "I think that's brave." "Grandpa." The simple statement from an 8-year-old landed with more weight than any adult wisdom could have carried. Charles felt his eyes sting unexpectedly. Louis, practical as always, asked, "Can we still visit you if you're not king?" Laughter broke through the tension, genuine, relieved, a release valve for pressure that had been building for weeks. Charles crossed to the sofa and pulled Louis into his lap. "Of course, darling," he said, voice rough with emotion. "I'll have much more time for visits. That's rather the point." The rest of the meeting dissolved into planning, into questions and answers, and the slow construction of a future that felt less like inevitability and more like choice. And if there was grief in it, grief for time lost, for pressures endured, for childhoods shortened and duties accepted too young, there was also relief. The relief of honesty, of shared burden, of facing the future together instead of waiting for it to arrive like a storm. Evening had settled over Windsor by the time they prepared to leave, winter darkness arriving early as it always did in January. The children were already in the car, Kate helping Louis with his seatbelt, while Charlotte and George bickered companionably about something inconsequential. William and Charles stood at the castle entrance, the goodbye stretching longer than usual, weighted with everything that had been said and decided over the past impossible weeks. "The letters said not to make your mistake," William said, quietly. "What do you think that mistake was?" Charles considered this, looking out at grounds he'd known his entire life, at stones that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more, long after all of them were dust. "Believing I had more time than I did. Believing I could control when the moment came." He turned to meet his son's eyes. "And now?" "Now I'm choosing the moment. That's the difference." They embraced then, longer than usual, and William felt his father's heartbeat against his chest, steady, if slightly irregular, still beating after 76 years of carrying impossible weight. William was halfway to the car when Charles stopped him. "Wait, there's one more thing. The letter mentioned something else, something coming." William turned back. "What?" "It didn't say exactly, just that there would be another letter. Soon." Charles's face had gone pale in the castle lights. "It said the next letter would be from someone else. Someone who needs to warn us. About something we haven't seen coming." William went cold, ice sliding down his spine. "Who?" "It didn't say. Just that we should watch for." A palace aide burst through the entrance, phone in hand, face drained of color, in a way that made both men freeze. "Sir," she gasped, looking at William, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a delivery at Kensington Palace. The security team just called. They need you to authorize." "They don't know what kind of delivery?" William's voice had gone very quiet, very controlled. The aide swallowed hard, her gaze flickering past William to where Kate stood by the car, then to the children visible through the windows. An envelope, cream-colored. No postmark, no way of tracking delivery. Addressed to, her voice dropped to barely a whisper, addressed to Prince George. With a date. William and Kate locked eyes across the distance between car and castle entrance. Understanding passed between them in a single look. "It's happening again, Dad," George's voice called from the car, curious and concerned. "What's wrong?" The tableau froze. William rooted between castle and car, between father and son, between the warning they'd just received and the child it concerned. Kate stood with her hand on the car door, torn between running to her son and running to her husband. Charles on the castle steps, the original letter still clutched in his hand, watching his family fragment under the weight of new impossibilities. And George, framed in the car window, 11 years old, solemn-eyed, already too aware, looking out at the adults with an expression that suggested he understood more than they wanted him to. The winter darkness pressed closer. Somewhere inside Kensington Palace, another envelope waited, another message from a future that shouldn't be able to reach backward into the present, another warning. Another choice. Another impossible thing that would reshape everything they thought they knew about. Time and fate and the burdens passed from generation to generation. Charles whispered, so quietly that only William could hear. It's starting. But William knew, with terrible certainty, that it had never really stopped. The future had always been coming, always been happening, always been reaching back to warn them about choices they didn't know they were making. Now, it was George's turn to receive the warning. Now, it was their turn to decide what to do with knowledge that no parent should have to carry. The car door stood open, the castle loomed behind them. And somewhere in London, a letter addressed to a child waited to reveal secrets that might save them or destroy them, or simply prove that the future, like the crown itself, was an inheritance you couldn't refuse, no matter how desperately you wanted to protect the ones you loved from its weight.